Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this second masterclass of the Masterclass series, Urbanizing Deltas of the World, the state of the art of water research in South and Southeast Asia. In this masterclass series, we have PhD and postdoc researchers from various projects of the NWO Urbanizing Deltas of the World program, and they present their work and discuss their lessons learned from their years of research activities with you. So, welcome. My name is Jaap Evers, and I'm a lecturer in water and environmental policy at IHE Delft. Today's topic is thinking about complex urbanizing systems. And today we have two speakers. That's Dr. Sanchayan Nath and Mr. Badrul Hasan. And they are giving their talking and discussing their work with you of their previous years. And let me go straight to the introduction of our first speaker. First speaker is Dr. Sanchayan Nath, and the topic of his presentation will be public policy and governance of social-ecological systems. Sanchayan was a postdoctoral researcher in the NWO-UDW project Living Polders. And currently, he's an assistant professor in public policy and governance at the Indian Institute of Technology in Tirupati. He completed his postdoctoral research at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University, here in the Netherlands. And he got a PhD in public policy from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs and the Department of Political Science in Indiana University, Bloomington, in the USA. With that being said, I introduce Dr. Sanchayan, and I give the floor to him. And after we have the same rules of engagement as in our first masterclass. So Dr. Sanchayan will give a presentation of about 30 minutes. During that time, you can put and write your comments in the comment boxes, either at YouTube or Facebook, or in one of the two where you have been logged in. When you write the comments, we are collecting them together. I do that today again with Leon Hermans and Shanur Hassan. And after the second presentation by Badrul Hasan, we are forwarding the questions to them in a Q&A session. I hope this is all clear. And let me give the floor to Sanchayan. Welcome, Sanchayan, to this masterclass. I'm very happy that you are with us, and please, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning to people in Europe and good afternoon to people in India, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Jaap, and thanks, IHE, for making this possible. I'm going to move straight to my presentation now. Let me just check. Okay, so hi, good afternoon again. I'm going to narrow down. I'm going to start off with a brief introduction of the project in general, and then narrow down on this one particular research article, which is titled Mental Models, Performance and Institutional Fit. So to give you a brief background, I have worked in the US and in the Netherlands. If you look at the map on the right-hand side, that's where I did my PhD. You know, it was next to Lake Michigan. And my field site was in India, if you can see my cursor move. And then I moved my postdoc to Europe, and my field site was very next to my hometown in India. Bangladesh and my hometown are very close to each other. And I also have some experience working in other sectors. The project of which I was a part was actually a part of the second call for proposals of the Urbanizing Deltas of the World program by NWO. The main applicant of this project was Dr. Fangran Lyroven of Copernicus Institute, and he had two other co-applicants, Dr. Hans Middelkoop of Utrecht University and Dr. Bernard Truffer of EWAG. Um, And for this research, I was assisted by a large number of research assistants from Khulna University primarily, and also from Independent University in Bangladesh, and also from A-Train India. I think I'd like to point out three RAs who really made important contributions to my research. Afsana, who kind of helped me complete my first research project when the project was really going slow. Mandira, who helped me with the second research article. And Nishat Sharmin, who helped complete our research amidst the pandemic. Nishat, I think, was one of my best RAs I've ever come across. So to give you a brief background, I'd like to show you two videos. The first video will be polders from the Netherlands, and the second video is a polder from Bangladesh. So the first video, I captured this video when I was biking along the polders. I spent a lot of time in Netherlands biking through the polders. And the second video is when I was doing my research in Bangladesh, traveling from one polder to another by boat. So let me share the first video. It's going to take some time. My machine is slightly slow. I think we can. No, hold on. No, I think let's skip the video. It's taking too long. Let me move on to my next slide. To give you a brief background of the study site, Bangladesh is located right next to India, around 8 hours by flight from the Netherlands. If we narrow down the focus, look at Bangladesh in general, it's next to the Bengali-speaking part of India. It's surrounded on all sides by India and partly by Myanmar. In Bangladesh, if you look at the map on the right, the whole country is considered to be a delta, but the delta is in different forms in different parts of the country. Our research was mainly focused on the mature delta part. If you see in the map, Khulna district, Satkhira, that region essentially. It's called a mature delta mainly because its connectivity to the upper upstream rivers have been completely disrupted because of man-made reasons and also because of natural reasons. In this region, in the mature delta part, the country has around 100 plus polders. The number actually is disputed, but there are more than 100 polders. What you see on the map on the right-hand side is the mature delta part of Bangladesh categorized into different polders, which are mainly known by their numbers. Our research primarily was focused in this region around Khulna, polders 2025, 21, 22, and the region in between. Now, let me take you through this concept called polder and this concept called TRM. A polder is essentially, in very simple terms, a piece of land which is surrounded by embankments on all sides. And outside the embankment, we have river. And the flow of water from the river into the land is controlled by sluice gates on the embankment. And this water which goes in is then directed using channels to shrimp farms, to agricultural land. And the land inside the polder also has houses, people living in there, community going on, human society in general. So a polder is essentially a large social-hydrological system where land water interact closely, and this interface is governed by this embankment. Now, essentially, if you look at the history of Bangladesh, in very simplified, brief terms, the country suffered from flooding, pre-independence, post-independence in the 1970s, and that's when plans came in collaboration with USAID and the Dutch government to build embankments around the rivers. And this essentially, the first phase came to be known as a CEP project. Now, what happened, these embankments, which essentially were based on the polders of Netherlands, the Netherlands is the country where the idea of polders essentially originated. When these polders came up, if you look at the figure where my mouse is moving, what you see in the first part of the figure is this rounded part, which essentially represents a river. So before the polders came in, the river would flood and the water would spread across on both sides into the lands nearby, agricultural land. Fertile sediments would flow into the lands, and this would provide huge, large agricultural productivity. At the same time, people, who are living next to these rivers were suffering immensely. Huge human strategy. So there was this huge discussion on how to balance this trade-off, the need for humans to live a comfortable life versus the need for fertile agricultural land. So at this time, what people decided, administrators decided, was to build embankments, polders along river banks. And what you see in the second figure where my mouse is moving is this embankments which came up. Now, when these embankments came up, as you can see, flooding stopped. The soil, the fertile soil which had been deposited earlier, ensured that the productivity of agricultural land continued for some time. But then trouble started in the mid or early 1980s. Because these embankments came up, waterlogging began to take place within the agricultural lands between the polders. So if you see these brown parts, these are the polders, these embankments along the rivers. And waterlogging started there. At the same time, the fertile soil, which at one time could flow during floods into the surrounding land, started getting accumulated in the river banks. So this led to twin trouble. This river started drying up. Bangladesh, which was known for its mighty rivers, some of these rivers got completely, they got converted to canals in simple terms. At the same time, waterlogging increased, and the problems that people were suffering pre-polderization in some ways began to come back. And that's when, local people in some ways, in very simplified terms, if I can explain it, people started breaching the polders, So they created these temporary holes in the embankments and let the water flow back into the lands. And this continued for some time for a few rivers, and then they would close it. So this practice, where people would breach embankments next to rivers, breach the polder embankments next to rivers to ensure that the land water dynamics went back to the pre-polder stage, essentially began to be known as tidal river management once technocrats started getting involved. So TRM essentially is a phenomena which began as a local community-driven initiative to ensure that Bangladeshi lands benefited both from polarization and from fertile soil reaching the lands. But when technocrats came in, they decided to do further studies and they decided to call it TRM. Now let me kind of pause here and think back a bit. If you look at polders as a concept, it's a very technocratic concept which started in the Netherlands. And when you look at TRM, it's a very much of a community-driven concept, which later on got adapted by technocrats. When you think of polders in Bangladesh, it's a technocratic concept which was brought in from abroad, from lands far away into Bangladesh. TRM, on the other hand, originated within the local community out there. And therefore, when we were doing our research, it really got us thinking, because we were talking about governing polders. We were talking of governing this complex socio-hydrological systems, human environmental interactions in this system. And we are wondering, do people really understand what a polder is? Do people really understand polders as well as TRM? Because our basic assumption was that something which was imported from far away, people would not really understand. But something like TRM, which had originated within the lands, people would understand. And that really got us to do this part of the research, where we wanted to understand what people thought about polders. Did they really know? Were local people describing polders to us in the same way that technocrats were? Did local people and technocrats look at TRM in the same way? So that's why we went back and decided to to study the mental models of local people, of technocrats, of politicians, of all people associated with the governance, people who live in the polders, who govern the polders. We wanted to see whether their understanding, whether their mental model of polders and whether the mental model of TRM was the same. Was it similar? Was it different? And what did it mean about governing polders? What if local people looked at polders differently from technocrats? What if local people looked at TRM differently from polders? Did it mean that the governance of polders was affected because of this difference in, or the similarities or the difference in mental models? And what did it mean ultimately about how these polders would be governed? That's what got us thinking into this project. So kind of go back and look at how we had structured the larger Living Polders project in general. We had started at the Delta level, published an article, looked at the regional level, published 3 articles. The mental models article that I'm going to talk to you about right now, essentially a part of that. And we've also done some research at the bill level, one of the articles of which is currently, we are in the writing phase. This was a very interdisciplinary project. There was a governance work package, which was being handled by me, and there was a hydrologic package, which is handled by Feroz Islam. And then later on, these 2 projects were going to be integrated. I was not a part of the project. I had moved on to my new job by then when the integration was supposed to take place. So today, like I've mentioned, we are essentially looking at how mental models affects governance of polders. So the research question which we're interested in is, what factors influence stakeholder mental models in polders, in social hydrological systems like the polders, and while governing management systems like TRM? And how do these mental models affect performance outcomes during implementing TRM and while managing polders? So we are interested in these 2 different concepts, polders and TRM, one of which is very technocratic in nature, technocratic derived, and TRM, which is very locally derived. And we're trying to understand where the difference in people's understanding, if you look at, when we think of mental models, we are essentially trying to understand how people understand polders. We are trying to look at their mental maps, which is what we call mental models. And then we are trying to see how mental models affect performance. So the research methodology we pursued for this was to first develop a reference model of polders and TRM. For this, we went back and looked at published literature, and we identified concepts. And using mental maps, using this software called Mental Modeler, we devised mental models of a theoretical mental model of polder and a theoretical mental model of TRM. So essentially what these mental models did was identified concepts and how they were linked with each other. So we had around, let's say polders having 50 concepts which are linked together using 100 connections. That's how these reference models were developed. Then we went back to local people, to local stakeholders, to local administrators, regional public officials, national level public officials, local politicians, people who live and work in the polders, and we did interviews with them. And in these interviews, we tried to understand what they understood about polders and what they understood about TRM. We tried to understand their mental models. So what we did is we went to this region, and I'll explain the region in further more detail after some slides. And we told them, so you live here, what do you think is a polder? And they would tell something to us. And then we would use this funneling technique, so whatever they told us, we would pick up those concepts and probe deeper and try to understand how they actually describe polders. How did they look at polders? In their minds, what was this image of polders? And we did the same thing for tidal river management. At the same time, we asked them questions, how is this polder? In what kind of state is it? Do you think people living are in a very vulnerable condition? Do you think this polder is badly damaged? Do you think it's not resilient enough? And we did this, I'm using technical terms, but we did this in much more locally understandable language. So once we had collected these interviews, we coded these interviews to develop the mental models of the stakeholders. And we did this by developing adjacency matrix. Adjacency matrix essentially is a list of concepts represented using matrix, where the connections are represented using 1 and 0. So let's say somebody says, for me, a polder is a piece of road for connectivity to the mainlands, to Khulna. So we would have 2 concepts, connectivity and road, and they would be connected together using 1, because roads lead to connectivity. Or somebody could say, a polder essentially is an embankment, is a bheribad, or a bath, or a wabda, which protects us from climate change. So then we would have a concept called bheribad, climate change, and because there's this positive connection, we use 1. So that's how we use these concepts we link them together and develop mental models using adjacency matrix of local stakeholders. Then we homogenized these mental maps. We had to compare the mental maps. So we ensured that all the mental models could be compared. Then we aggregated them, developed aggregated mental models. And aggregate mental models were done for different categories of people. So we developed aggregated mental models of local people. We developed aggregated mental models of local politicians. We developed aggregated mental models of blue-collar employees, of local public officials, of regional public officials. And then we carried out analysis of mental models using matrix algebra and social network theory. We also did some GIS work, and finally we analyzed all this data using regression. And I'll take you through some of the results in a few slides. So, I was telling about the interviews we conducted. So we conducted interviews with 250 respondents. And what you see here on the right-hand side is the number of respondents broken down into the categories I was talking about. So we interviewed 125 local residents, 55 local politicians, and so on and so forth. Then, if we narrow down further, we found that only 222 people exactly knew what a polder was. The remaining 28 people said, no, we don't know what a polder is. And then again, we have broken down these 222 people according to category. For example, 109 people out of 125 local residents said that they know what a polder is. The remaining 16 people said, no, we don't know what a polder is. Same thing we did for TRM. But the strange part was, even people who knew polders actually said they did not understand TRM. Now, go back to what I said earlier. A polder is a technocratic concept imported from the Netherlands. Local people should really have less familiarity with it. TRM is a local phenomena. Local people actually developed it on their own. But we find here a very surprising finding that very few people were actually saying that they knew what a TRM was, what it meant for them. So I'll keep this in mind, and I'll kind of talk about it more in later slides. Now, this is our research site in greater detail. Like I told you, our research was focused on the mature delta part, mainly between polders 24-25 and 21-22. And the reason we picked up this region was because if you look at the map on the right-hand side, there's this river which flows from polder 24-25 up here and goes and meets a larger river near polder 21-22. So essentially, we conducted our surveys along this river, the Sipsha River, which is known by different names, in between these polders, along the polders on both sides of the river. And what you see here are these different political units which overlap with the polders. So if you look at the next, if I can take you through the next slide, these are three different maps of the same region. You see the same river here. The first river, on the first figure, you have the maps. So Bangladesh is administered along different political levels of political boundaries, and unions is the lowest level of governance. It is the smallest level of governance for Bangladesh. Highest probably the country, then we have divisions, then we have districts, so on and so forth. So what you see here is the same research site classified according to unions. And what you see here is the same research sites classified according to polders and then according to physiographic region. What you wanted to see was if we analyzed our respondents by classifying them according to unions or by polders or by physiographic region, did their understanding vary? So we wanted to see what was really happening there. A physiographic region is essentially an agroecological region. In the upstream parts of the river, the agricultural regions are, more fertile soil, less saline. The lower parts are more saline, less fertile, because of salinity intrusion and all that. So the whole region can be classified into different unions, different polders, and different physiographic regions. The red dots that you see are our respondents. Now you'll notice that some of the dots are along the rivers. Some of the dots are slightly further away from the rivers, and some are slightly more further away. That's because we had applied this transect method for identifying respondents. What we did was we first mapped the river, the total distance from the top of polder 24-25, wherever it started, before it got disrupted, to the river on top, to the point where it merged with the larger river. So whole distance, we then divided into 5-kilometer parts. And every 5 kilometers, we conducted interviews on both sides of the river. So here, this is the first 5-kilometer mark, the second 5-kilometer mark, so on and so forth. And every point, we interviewed 2 households. And in the first household, we interviewed a male respondent. In the second household, we interviewed a female respondent. Once we had interviewed people at 5 kilometer distances along the rivers. We identified the next motorable road at a distance of 5 kilometers inland, and we administered a river interviews there. A similar round of couple of interviews at every 5 kilometers, and we also did it at slightly larger distances wherever we could find motorable roads at 10 kilometer distances. In addition, we focused a larger number of interviews in the TRM regions of the research sites. Now, in our research section, it's mainly polder 24, which has TRM taking place. So you'll see a larger section of interviews conducted there, because initially when we are conducting interviews, we were really surprised that this disparity, that some people did not know what a TRM was, whereas a larger number of people knew what TRM was, or what polders was. So you thought, okay, let's go and focus more of our interviews in the TRM regions to see what was happening. Why are fewer people saying that they know what TRM is? And you see the same kind of stakeholder respondent distribution, interview distribution in the three maps. Now, this is our theoretical framework. This is essentially what we wanted to study. Let me kind of take you through the first part of the theoretical framework. This block that you see is mental model similarity. Our first hypothesis is that resident characteristics determine mental model similarity. So our assumption could be that irrespective of gender, people have the same mental models, or irrespective of age, people have the same mental models. Irrespective of education, mental models could be similar, so on and so forth. Then look at the second connection. If the mental models of respondents living in a region are similar, then they would have similar perceptions of performance. So let's say there's polder 24, then all respondents, if the mental models are similar, then that polder would probably, people would say, okay, we have similar impressions about performance in that polder. But this relationship is affected by the context. And what could be the context? We look at two kinds of variables, political and biophysical. So if there's a polder in which local people are involved in administering the polder, we study that. We study that as rules. Are there locally defined rules for governing the polders? Are the polders more conflict-ridden? So what we wanted to see is this mental model similarity and this relation between mental model similarity and performance. Is it affected by the political context? We also wanted to look at the biophysical context. If you look at the physiographic map that we looked earlier, so what happens in different physiographic regions? Does mental model similarity, are mental models different? And is this connection between similarity and perceptions different? Is it affected by the biophysical context? That's what we wanted to study. And by looking at this whole relationship, we wanted to see how that affects governance, this idea of institutional fit. Now, let me kind of explain to you what institutional fit or misfit means. In a system in which the rules are defined so that they match the underlying political conditions, the underlying social conditions, the underlying ecological conditions. If there's a match between the rules, the institutions, and underlying conditions, then there's institutional fit. And theory says that such systems should be well governed. So if there's a system in which the rules are framed according to local context and people understand the rules well, then that system should be well governed. So if we go back and link institutional fit to the larger theoretical framework here, mental model similarity, if mental models are similar of people living in a polder, then that should lead to similar perceptions of performance, and that should lead to institutional fit. However, if people do not understand what a polder is, if their understanding of polders is different, then their understanding of governance, their understanding of performance of the polders would be different. And that would lead to institutional misfit, which means that if people did not understand what a polder is, it would mean that a polder is not being governed well, which basically means that local government, regional government should invest more time in ensuring that people understand what polder is. The same thing applies for TRM. If mental models of TRM are similar, then the perceptions of performance should be similar, and that should lead to better governance. That is the theoretical framework which you're trying to study. And that is the public policy governance, social-hydrogeological system connection that we are studying. Sorry. So if you look at this, this is our first results side. So the mental models that we derived from our interviews, we identified the most important, which is the concept which most people were talking about to describe polders. So what you see here are for those 250 people, out of 222 people who described polders to us, what did they think a polder was? I want to point out to you three different concepts. embankment. A lot of people are saying polders are embankments. A second group of people were saying embankment is wabda. Now remember this word, embankment, wabda, and a lot of people were talking about beribads. So, although we are talking about polders, people were actually using different concepts to describe a polder. Now let me kind of explain to you what these three concepts is. Embankment in Bengali is bath. It's a part of a polder which is built between the land and the river. In simple terms, when some people were saying polder bath ke amra polder boli. A second group was saying no, polders are bheribad ke amra bath boli. Now try to understand the difference between bath and bheribad. A bath is built next to a river. A bheribad is built within agricultural land or around a pond, around a piece of water, in order to separate it from the surrounding agricultural land. It's a smaller dam kind of a thing. So a bath and a bheribad are very different concepts. A polder essentially should be a bath. We build embankments along a river. We don't build bheribad along a river generally. And a third group of people were calling it wabda. Now this is very interesting. If you go to the polder region of Bangladesh, if you go and stand on a polder and ask them what it is, they'll say, "Amra wabdar opore dariye achi." A lot of people equate polder to wabda. Now wabda is essentially a governance institution. It was the water management board set up by the Pakistani government before Bangladesh attained independence. Now look at two important points. One, local people, in spite of having attained from Pakistan, was still using a Pakistani era term to describe a concept which is now relevant for them. They were not even using the current term for Water Development Board, BWDB. They were not saying embankment is BWDB. They are saying WABDA, and they were not distinguishing that it was WABDA who created the bath, the embankment, the polder, who could have at some point in time been involved. They're confused between a hydrological term and a political term. So keep this in mind. Now let's look at TRM. In TRM, we found this same fuddling, this misconfusion about what TRM essentially means. Most people are talking about it in terms of sedimentation. A lot of people were talking about it in terms of what was the next? They were talking about in terms of inundation of bill. So in a lot of cases, they were talking about creating this village protection dam. When you talk of TRM, essentially it is a breach created. The first thing that should come in mind when people say about TRM is that, amra bath take kete diyechi. We breached the dam. But no, they were using a wide variety of terms. In the minds of local people, it was this once a breach had been created, and then a kind of a dam, a local bheribad is built around this local water body, the village protection dam. They equate TRM to that. They are not even talking about a breach. So even local people who live in that region are not sure about what TRM actually means. So keep this in mind as we move to the next slide. Now, what we've done here is mapped all our interviews using swarm plots. So what you see are these interviews as swarms, and we have used 4 different mental model concepts: total components, total connections, density, and weighted clustering coefficient, to mark out our interviews. So what you see, the black parts are the individual mental models, and the colored dots, these are the collective mental models, which are aggregated of the individual mental models. So if you look here, this is the aggregated mental model of the residents. First thing, most people appear to be the mental models of most people in some ways, if you look at the concepts, they're using a very, very smaller number of concepts, smaller number of connections with very low density or medium density to describe the mental models. Mental models of most respondents, irrespective of whether they were local officials, local politicians, blue collar employees, NGOs, they were very, very simplistic. Now, this in some ways is a contradiction of theory. If you look at theory, they would say that public officials have a richer mental model, which is more theoretically oriented. Theoretical mental models would kind of be similar to public official mental models. But we found no, when we interviewed the public officials, they appear to be very simple mental model that they're using. But here, it could just be that because we were doing telephone interviews, some of them, they were just giving us simpler mental models because of the research method too. But more than that, what's the most stark contradiction is that most mental models are very similar, simplistic. Collective mental models are more complex. And try to understand this difference. If collective mental models are more complex as compared to of the individual mental models, it means the individual mental models are very different from each other. They could be simplistic, but they're different. So some people are saying polders are embankments, some are saying very bad, some are saying roads. A lot of people are saying a polder is a road. Same thing for TRM. We again see the same kind of clustering. The collective mental models appear to be very similar to each other, but they are very different from the mental models, individual mental models. Now, this is an expansion of the previous slide. What we have tried to see is how these collective mental models, how are they similar or different from theoretical mental models. So ideally, if the local mental models are correct, if they are describing polders correctly, then the collective mental models, they should be wide overlap. This part outside, this pink and green part, they should be thinner. So if the mental models of local people are theoretically aligned, if they're more accurate in some ways, there would be more overlap. It would be something like this. But what we find is that when we compare theoretical models to collective mental models, the collective mental model of local officials or local politicians, they are very, very different from the theoretical mental models. They are not so accurate. On the other hand, collective mental models appear to be quite similar to each other. So although there is wide disparity in individual mental models, collective mental models become similar, which means that irrespective of whether it's local resident, local politicians, or NGOs, most of these respondents don't know what a polder is, and they are very different from the theoretically accurate mental models. With this similar kind of description for TRM. So in very simple terms, mental models of local respondents, either of a technocratic concept like polders or a locally community-derived concept like TRM, one, they are different from each other. Some of them are probably slightly accurate, a lot of them are completely inaccurate, and because of this, the collective mental models are inaccurate. Now, let me kind of take a step back and look at this difference about why some people disclose their mental models and some didn't. So what we did was, we tried to understand what percentage of people who described polders, how many disclosed their mental models and didn't. So, it was almost like an 80-20 relationship. 87% of our respondents disclosed their mental models, but 75% of our respondents did not disclose, the same respondents did not disclose their TRM models. So we tried to understand if this varied according to where they were located on the river. Is it true that people who lived in the upstream regions of the river, where most of the TRM activities have taken place, is it true that people who live up there understand TRM better than people who live downstream where no TRM has taken place? In some ways, we find that this hypothesis holds, that people who live around where TRM was conducted, that's where most people say they understand polders. But if you move further downstream to the lower parts of the river, they refuse to disclose what TRM is. Now, kind of try to understand two concepts here. One, if TRM is a local concept, then shouldn't people across the river, the same river getting breached at multiple points, even downstream, they should know what a polder is, what a TRM is, but they don't. And in downstream parts of the river, there's another polder where TRM is currently taking place, and even respondents who kind of live near that region refuse to disclose what TRM is. And our hypothesis there, our explanation for that is TRM probably is a very disputed concept. Whenever TRM has been conducted in the past, even the current one which is currently ongoing, it's always been characterized by dispute. And dispute makes people wary of talking about it to strangers. So because TRM was so conflict-ridden, they did not want to speak to researchers, even a researcher like me from India who spoke Bengali, or even my RAs who were from a local university who spoke Bengali and who looked and spoke like them. Even with them, they were probably not willing to disclose what TRM is. They're not willing to discuss. For polders, we didn't see any upstream, downstream concept phenomena. So polders, people kind of either knew it or did not know it, irrespective of whether they were located. It was other variables which were making an effect on the understanding of polders. So to kind of probe deeper into this, we ran regression analysis. We ran about 25 models. This is too small to understand, and I'll explain to you what we've done here. So what we did was try to understand these different concepts, how they were associated with performance. So in is it true that statistically gender has an effect on mental model similarity, or age, or education, access to authority? And how does that affect understanding of performance? And this other way, the other context. What about context? So in general, what we found is, first one, men understood polders better than women, and this was quite stark across our physiographic regions, across our polders. And we believe it's mainly because in a country like Bangladesh, in the region we were working, it's slightly conservative, slightly patriarchal, and most women probably are expected to do housework. They don't really go, they're not expected. They probably work in the farms, they probably do go fishing, during extreme survival needs, but they're expected to be at home, and therefore they're not so connected to the polder. They understanding they don't really need to know polders, and that probably affects understanding of polders. Women in a way don't feel connected to polders as much as probably men do. Again, access to authority. We found that respondents who had spoken to researchers like us, or people or respondents who'd taken part in various conferences, they understood polders better. So access to authority, people who worked in maintenance of polders, they understood polders better. So in general, what we found is that in spite of the fact that the resident characteristics affect mental model similarity, but while mental models were similar some cases, in a lot of cases they were different, and that was affecting performance, and that was leading to misperformance of the polders. And that is essentially what we are testing, the theoretical framework, and which is what our findings were. I think I'll stop here. I don't know how long I've taken. I hope I'm within time. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Sanchayan, and I'm very impressed by the rigor in your work. There have been some questions already in the comment box on either YouTube or the Facebook comments. Please continue to share your comments, dear audience, because we are collecting those and we will forward them later to Dr. Sanchayan. And I was very much wondering also, when we are talking about different mental models of poldering and tidal river management, what it then would mean for mental models of depoldering. So maybe we can talk about that later, as well. As in the Netherlands, depoldering is an issue, and maybe there's some understanding by some that tidal river management is also a form of depoldering, when you propose that as an innovative way to a more sustainable management of the poldered areas in Bangladesh. But let's talk about that after our second presenter. So thank you very much, Sanchayan. I found it very interesting. We'll discuss further after our second speaker. With that having been said, our second speaker is already here on screen. Welcome, Badrul Hasan. It's very nice to have you with us. And the topic of Badrul is a community management plus model for the governance of rural drinking water systems. And he did a comparative case study on pond center filter systems in coastal Bangladesh. Badrul is about completing his PhD. He's going to defend it soon, as I have understood. So that's a very exciting moment in your academic career. And he was a PhD researcher at the NWO Urbanizing Deltas of the World project Delta Mar, and which is about governance and hydrogeological prerequisites for sustainable water supply through Mar systems in urbanizing deltas. And they applied that in Bangladesh. And I'm quite sure that Badrul gives a little bit more of an explanation about it. So as I mentioned, currently Badrul is finishing his PhD at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at the Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And his PhD topic was about the governance of rural drinking water systems in developing countries, focusing on coastal Bangladesh, which he's going to talk about more with us. And in addition to that, he's also an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh. And as I've understood, he's in Dhaka currently and is sharing his knowledge and insights with us from Dhaka. Basically, his areas of expertise include groundwater governance and common resource management and institutional analysis. And this complex mixture of knowledge he is going to share with us. I see that his presentation is almost ready to go. So thank you very much, Badrul, for being here with us. I see we now need to move away from the presenters mode to the presentation mode. And then I give the floor to you when you're ready. Takes a little more time to get the presentation correct in the screen. So let us wait for that. And let me then also continue to ask you to share your comments in the comment boxes. And let me also, for the people who are new in this masterclass series, that last week we had our first masterclass, which was about sinking, shrinking, and saltier deltas. And via the links that are on our webpage where we communicate about these masterclass series, you can also go to the YouTube videos that are recorded of this first masterclass, and in which Dr. Philippe Minderhout and Dr. Sepin Islami had presented their work on the Mekong Delta, in which they studied soil subsidence and soil intrusion. And I see that Badrul is coming back in. Yes, everything is there except for a video. I hope we can see Badrul soon. Maybe, Badrul, I hope you can hear me. You might turn off your video because it appears that the connection where you're from is not supportive to us today. And otherwise, let me go back to Sanchayan, because maybe we can have some questions already discussed with him. Sanchayan, yeah, so let us wait for Badrul, his connections to be fixed. There has been a question in the comment box. One on also the collection of your data and how you are selecting the different respondents. You have mentioned something about the distance from people living from the rivers. Could you explain a little bit more? Because I think this person is very interested in how to go to a representative sample for studying this.
Yeah, I'll just share my screen.
Yeah, maybe you can just explain, and
Is my screen
office can also get into support with Mr. Badrul.
Okay, let me stop sharing then. Um, so I'd like to respond to your question, I think, in two, three different ways, because I'm not sure exactly what Shariat Ullal was asking me. So what is the criteria for selecting 200 units as households? So 250 units, mainly we stopped. So there were different kinds of stakeholders: local respondents, local public officials, local politicians, teachers, and all kinds, different kinds of stakeholders. For local respondents, we stopped once saturation had been reached. So if you remember where I showed you this river and you are traveling on different roads, once we felt that we kind of reached saturation, we stopped. At the same time, we divided the river into slots of 5 kilometer distances. So we first covered along the river the first stretch, then we went inland, then we went further inland, and we were beginning to see that there was not much variation. People are saying very, very similar things. We were not finding the kind of variation we would expect. So for local respondents, because we are doing face-to-face interviews, traveling by bike along different roads, we stopped once saturation had been reached. We could have, had we found variation, we could have gone, let's say, at a 2 kilometer stretch or a 3 kilometer stretch and tried to do more intensive interviews. We didn't. And like I said, for TRM, we did more interviews, more stringent interviews, more closely, because we are not sure what was happening, because so few people were talking about TRM. Now, for local officials, local politicians, regional officials, these interviews were conducted just before COVID was going to begin and after COVID began, and therefore we did them over telephone. And therefore, here we stopped once we did not find any more people to interview. Once we called up as many BWD people in Khulna, Joshore, Shatkhira, whose numbers we could find. LGED, BWD, Forest Department, Agricultural Department, a host of these departments. And after some time they stopped. They would just not answer our calls. We also spoke to the Union Parishad members. We spoke to Union Parishad officials there, and we followed the same strategy. So that 250 number that you see out there is mainly saturation in terms of local respondents and availability. 15% of our telephone interviews were successful, 85 to 90%, or 80 to 90% of our respondent interviews were successful. So that gives you an idea of how we came up with that number. And I don't know if I've answered Muhammad Ullal's question. I'm not sure if he's still there. But if he has further questions, I'm happy.
Yeah, I hope you did. What I find also interesting is that you showed two word clouds. One of the mental models of your interviewees on polders, and one of the mental models of the responses from your interviewees on tidal river management. And in polders, I think one of the largest words was flooding. And in tidal river management, it was sedimentation. Well, my understanding is that sedimentation only comes with flooding. But my own mental model is when I hear flooding, I see that as something negative. And when I hear about sedimentation, I understand that as something positive. Could you explain a little bit more? Is there also a positive or a negative connotation about either land management?
So in polders, you see flooding as an important, as a very important concept in polders, mainly because people are saying polders protected us from flooding. So it's an embankment which protects us from flooding. So that's why you see flooding there. And you see polders in TRM, you see sedimentation, because there I think there's a muddling of concept. We found that people in some way or the other could, if they knew what a polder was, they probably would say it's a bath, peri bath, or wabda, so they were in some ways knew that there was this embankment kind of a thing which was there, but they didn't know that there would be a sluice gate there. I mean, for them, polder is either a road, an embankment, a bheribad, or a wabda. What about these drainage canals which flow from the sluice gate into the agricultural lands? Why aren't people talking about them? So there were a lot of these concepts which should be there, they were not. So that's why I said the concepts are very, very simplistic. A lot of people say road for connectivity, embankment for flood protection, road for planting trees. So they've seen forestry department people planting trees on the embankments which are used as roads. So they say, it is used, the trees are there and they protect as shade. I don't know if the word shade or something like that is also there. It may have been just a minor term. No, that's probably not there. But for TRM, it's complete modeling. So you should say breach closer. You should say water coming in, water going out, salinity intrusion, and then some of the minor concepts should be this village protection dam and things like that. Um, Actually, my understanding there is that it depends on how the person has been affected. This is something we didn't test. If it's somebody who owns land out there and who's benefited from it, if it's a rich farmer or a politically influential farmer, he would probably know what TRM is, and he would probably be willing to discuss it. But if it's somebody who's been badly affected by it, for him, it's his land getting flooded, it is land getting washed away, or it's just sediment happening on his pond, or it's just the shrimp mafia taking his land. So
Yes. Thank you.
so
What
that's why you see
I
those
think would be
differences there.
nice to discuss further when we have finished also the presentation by Badrul is to then also think further on what this then means for the development, the sustainable development in Bangladesh in relation to the Delta Plan 2100, if it also actually proposes tidal river management and how that then relates to the mental models of the local government officials that then in the end needs to manage and implement those. I see Badrul is here with us again, so I'm immediately giving then the floor back to you. And I cannot hear you, to be frank. Badrul, we cannot hear you. Maybe it's wise to unplug your headset so that maybe your laptop that you are using can use its internal microphone. This is very unfortunate what's going on now because we still do not have sound from you, Badrul. Let's send you one more time back to our back support and to see if we can fix your sound together. And maybe then Sanchayan. So in relation to the question that I posed to you, in how far the mental models of local government officials in relation to TRM, tidal river management, has maybe also an influence on introducing this concept for sustainable development of the southwestern delta in Bangladesh.
I think we need to do a few more studies. A lot of us, field researchers, when we go there, we get introduced to people who probably are the local elite there. And that kind of colors our perception to a large extent. And also kind of try to understand what happens to people who move away from the site, because once TRM happens, the land gets submerged and they migrate. A lot of the people who suffer badly are the people who've migrated out to different parts of Bangladesh or maybe outside Bangladesh. We don't speak to them. When we hear their stories, our perception of TRM probably changes. I mean, it's important that we focus. I mean, TRM is a very interesting concept. Living with nature, ensuring that the sluice gates work, ensuring that salinity does not enter the lands. These are important considerations. But if you look at, I think there's this technocratic versus local thing that we talk about. I think it continues to affect even high level academics. I mean, I'm saying that because I'm not in Bangladesh right now. But I think it is important to realize that not all local people are happy with things there with TRM. Polders, it has given them huge benefit. It has protected them from flooding, and they're acknowledging it. But they don't know what a polder is. Some of them are saying a polder is a ward. A polder is they're mixing a hydrological concept with a political concept. That shouldn't be happening. So either they don't even know that LGD is the administrative public agency which is responsible for roads, or that it also maintains these embankments. There's a lot of confusion. Of course, these are very poor people. They may not be expected to know these things. But what about union level local politicians or union level officials? I think it's important to really understand that the poorest of the poor in Bangladesh, how are they affected by shrimp farming? This literature on aquaculture that's well available. Link it to TRM. It's obvious to anybody who goes there that these saltwater intrusion is destroying people's livelihood. It's well documented, and TRM in some ways also leads to it. It leads to agricultural productivity. Vegetables grow, but some things don't grow back. I mean, I've spoken to people. Some say, yeah, these trees, we haven't seen them in years in Bilkokshia. Some will say, yeah, they come back. Some will say they're coming back. Also, I think we should travel along these rivers upstream, this lush green parts of Joshore. And then we come down Khulna, this river is drying. I think we really need to look at poor, marginalized farmers in greater detail when we talk about TRM and see how it can be customized. The way it's been proposed right now, even, you just can't get sanity into the lands. Helping shrimp farmers may increase GDP, but who benefits most from it? I mean, people still remain as poor as they were during independence. GDP may have increased, but most people are still very poor. That's my only observation, primary observation.
Yeah, thank you. Would you also think in relation to that same issue maybe that because tidal river management in one way is also a very traditional form of land management, land and water management in that area, that people regard it as old-fashioned, non-development, and that would hinder. So is there a need to rethink then also tidal river management as a way forward for more sustainable development of this area?
I think we need to understand that this Oshtomashi Bath, this idea of breaching dams, creating temporary dams before polders came in, it's different from tidal river management. The same conditions don't prevail anymore. Tidal river management, the way we see it right now, it can be theoretically and by argument linked back to this concept of people living in balance with nature before polarization. It's not the same anymore. When they were doing it, we were not having sand intrusion the way it's happening now. Shrimp farming was not there. So if some people are saying, tidal river management is a traditional concept, I beg to differ. And I'm willing to stand my ground. I mean, I may be saying something which may not be acceptable, but that's where it is. It's not the same. It's linked. The origins may be similar. And how do you go back to that pre-polderist times? These rivers, first of all, most of them are covered with mud. It's in really sad, a lot of these rivers. Polders have come up. You cannot remove them completely. And if you create TRM like holes out there, breach them, then why aren't the sluice gates working? It's the same thing. A sluice gate is a breach which is more systematically operated. If sluice gates don't operate, TRM, how is that different in creating a hole out there and letting water come in and go? Make the sluice gates operate. I mean, make them operational is my argument. So I think we are calling TRM as a long-term solution, the way it's being done, and trying to link it back to Ostomashi Badwala concept, I think is wrong in my opinion. I don't know if that's what others would say, but we need to distinguish between them.
Yes, and we of course very much appreciate your expert opinion. Um, I'm looking a little bit now at the private chat that we have here in our in the back room, and wondering if Badrul is ready to get back in. Um, and let us wait for a second. I hear no. Then, because I get the message that his connection is just lost again, which is of course very pitiful, especially for the people who have been looking forward to hearing his research work. And as mentioned by Laura in the comment box, um, that is one of the luxuries that one have with a proper with a good internet connection. Um, what we are going to do is that we are going to fall back to a backup. Is that we are going to record Mr. Badrul his presentation, and that we are going to share that later online, because there is not sufficient time anymore as well in this masterclass to stream it live, which is very unfortunate. Um, and with that then being said, I have a final question then for Dr. Sanchayan before we are moving forward. So from the past years of research that you have done, what is your main message that you would like to put forward to our community of Delta practitioners and managers to move in relation to this idea of complex thinking, how human and water systems relate and interact together, on moving towards a sustainable development of them? Based on your research, what is your main message to our community?
Well, what I'm going to say might sound like a very a simple message, but I think we need to start focusing more on the social. Sure, a polder, an embankment, a TRM, these are all technological, technical, hydrological concepts. But I think we are ignoring the local a lot, the local people, the poorest of the people. Just talking to technocrats, local leaders, local academics out there does not solve a problem. We should do more research with the poorest of the poor, people who live in the shanties, who live right next to the TRM sites, who hunt for small pieces of fish. If you go there on the sites early morning, those are the people we should really talk to, because a majority, in spite of Bangladesh having developed a lot, I think there's a lot of people out there who are really poor. And if you're talking about sustainable development, development for the poor, public policy, it is those people who matter, because the rich people will leave the country, they'll move to India, they'll move to the US, to UK. It's the poor people who are going to get covered with saline water sooner or later when climate change really takes place. That's my message. Sorry for sounding very simple, but
Thank you. Well, and it is, I think, a fair message in relation, and there might be an interesting connection, and again with your with how you showed that there are various mental models among the various stakeholders in these systems that in relation to participatory planning and development, to take a variety of stakeholders on board in participatory developing and formulating these kinds of development plans, and to be aware of the variety of understandings and perceptions of people on the delta itself or the polder itself, but also, of course, on the problems and the solutions that can be proposed for a sustainable development. Thank you very much, Sanchayan. Let me also already thank Badrul for trying, and that it has been very unfortunate that his connection got lost. But we, as mentioned, we will record his presentation, and we are going to share that online on our YouTube channel and also on our website, in which we promote this masterclass series. That brings me to closing then this masterclass, and I'm going to invite you to join us again next week. In next week's masterclass, in Masterclass 3, and the topic is on adapting and innovating for managing and developing deltas. And we have then invited 2 speakers, again, just like today and next week. And may I ask the back office to share my screen so people can see. Next week on Wednesday, 29 September, we have Uma Kulsum, who did her PhD for the TU Delft University. And she will be talking about adaptive delta management with a systematic exploration of community livelihood adaptation as uncertainty. So she further explores the concept of adaptive management. And we have Dr. Vo Thi Minh Hoang of Wageningen University. And her topic is on the role of innovation in the Vietnamese delta planning processes. So next week we are going to look into the Bangladesh Delta and the Vietnam Mekong Delta with these 2 very smart women. Thank you very much for joining. Apologies for the technical errors that have occurred with us today. Nevertheless, we will record Mr. Badrul his presentation so that we can share that with you. We are looking forward to seeing you again next week in our 3rd masterclass on adapting and innovating for managing and developing deltas. Thank you very much, and looking forward to see you again.